Some of you are probably thinking, Ryan, a buddy cop comedy seems a bit outside your typical genre patterns. Well, this is where things get interesting. While we could sit and talk about Hot Fuzz as a parody of American action flicks like Point Break, Lethal Weapon, and Bad Boys, it's also just as equally a murder mystery that derives a fair bit of influence from both slasher flicks and Britain's heritage of detective fiction. Given director and co-writer Edgar Wright's last film, Last Night in Soho, explored his fondness for Italy's gruesome Giallo genre with its lush, hyper-stylized violence, that provocativeness was already particularly apparent in Hot Fuzz, which takes an alarmingly and jarringly grotesque turn after its deceptively sardonic and quirky first half. Now, if you're new to my channel or missed the opening of last week's video, throughout the month of September, I'm going to be covering Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg's Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, which includes Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. As such, there's going to be a lot of thematic back and forth between all three videos, specifically regarding this idea of de-romanticization. I know it's not technically a word, but I highly recommend you watch part 1 on Shaun of the Dead to give you a framework for what I mean. Last time, we explored Shaun of the Dead's coming-of-age rom-com themes of killing old habits and the fear and resistance to change, motivation, and responsibility as you approach your 30s. This time, we're going to talk about the fallacy of being that all-too-motivated, hyper-responsible early 30-something-year-old and forgetting how to enjoy the simple pleasures in life. Admittedly, I dreaded covering Hot Fuzz because it's probably the most conceptually simplistic film in the trilogy, as in the words of star and co-writer Simon Pegg, it wholeheartedly commits to the premise of making an American-style action movie in a parochial, bucolic British setting. That's definitely not to say it isn't as richly complex or detailed as Shaun or World's End. Heck, I think it's unquestionably the best film in the trilogy, and just all around one of the best comedies ever made. However, as I said in my Shaun video, Wright and Pegg have said in multiple interviews that the overall trilogy works purely because they balance a fine line between grounded and naturalistic characters and stories, and playfully tropey and sensationalized self-aware execution, and Hot Fuzz is probably the purest in this regard. Hot Fuzz is a masterpiece, one of my absolute favourite films. I could watch it endlessly and never get bored. And as a horror fan, I think a big part of it is just how unflinchingly brutal it manages to be amongst the non-stop laughter. As always, as we go along, please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, including a cheeky wee like and subscribe. And lastly, here are a few words from this video's sponsor, Grammarly. Being the sole writer of all my videos and the director of my own company, I have a tremendous love-hate relationship with words and writing, because if I'm not in a good flow, I'm likely suffering from writer's block. Grammarly is designed to help with this. It's an AI-powered writing tool that assists in brainstorming new topics, giving me jolts of inspiration, and even revising and polishing my occasionally contrived scripts to make them sound clear and coherent to those on the receiving end. It does all this without changing or replacing my original voice, as I can cater Grammarly to the tone that reflects my own writing style, and I can adapt it accordingly until I'm happy with the result. For example, I can take stubborn, long-winded paragraphs and have Grammarly restructure them into something cleaner, more practical, and easier to narrate, thus saving me precious time, and even highlighting ways I can improve my own writing blind spots in the future. Additionally, when it comes to replying to constant emails from important parties, Grammarly can even write my replies in the most efficient way possible, so I can get straight back to what matters, and that's making these videos. Lastly, I can use Grammarly to spark ideas for concepts and even prompt a starting point to give myself that much needed sense of direction and motivation when my brain refuses to cooperate. Best of all, Grammarly is free to use and try out for yourself, so why not sign up and download Grammarly today by using my code grammarly.com/ryanhollinger09. And if you want extra features, my link will also get you 20% off Grammarly Premium. Hot Fuzz tells the story of London Metropolitan Police Sergeant Nicholas Angel, a highly motivated, academically and physically disciplined hardass who's so feverishly devoted to his job that Pegg's ability to completely shake away Shaun is immediately apparent. In fact, Angel is so ridiculously good at his job that he receives a promotion and is transferred to a small rural village called Sanford, because his individual arrest records and achievements make the rest of the Met Police look lazy, unmotivated, unmotivated and badly organized. Once there, he's faced with the reality that there just isn't much to do, given the village has a reputation for its peacefulness and zero documented crime. But of course, before long, certain controversial locals start dying in mysterious accidents, which Angel believes are staged to cover up murder. Described as Midsummer Murders directed by Michael Bay, there truly couldn't be a more fitting description, because while its climax is an absolutely ludicrous payoff hyped up throughout by momentary jolts of hyper-stylized, uneventful police procedural work, the murder mystery becomes the central focus of Angel's time in Sanford. For those outside the UK, Midsummer Murders was once one of Britain's most popular primetime detective shows that's still going strong after 25 years. Along with more, let's say, light-hearted detective programming like Tiger, Touch of Frost, and some daytime shows like Father Brown, about a priest who moonlights as a detective, seriously, that's an actual show based on an actual short story series, Britain has an immense reputation for its police procedurals and detective fiction that goes right back to Agatha Christie whodunit novels that carried the legacy of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes to the penny dreadful pulp magazines that capitalised on the fear and hysteria of Britain's once deeply disturbing seedy underbelly. That's the extra bit of genius to Hot Fuzz I rarely hear anyone mention. It plays off these sometimes theatrical levels of murder in low-key British detective shows to the point they're borderline unrealistic and just pure farce. Hell, let's not forget Sherry over there portrayed a cadaver on Prime Suspect. In the case of Midsummer Murders, going on my vague memories, it focused on a new killer every week terrorizing the same couple of very small idyllic country villages in the fictional county of Midsummer, making you wonder why the goddamn army don't step in to deal with the absurd pandemonium. For perspective, imagine if all of Stephen King's stories took place in the same universe. Maine is to America what Midsummer is to England. We'd be best just building a big dome around it to contain whatever eldritch chaos and madness is happening there. More so, Hot Fuzz portrays a similar ignorance to shows like Midsummer, where the locals just blissfully move on with their lives after each devastating traumatic event, and it's never brought up again like a cartoon where the world seemingly resets itself at the end of each episode. Small villages and towns were always a better selling point for murder mysteries than a big metropolitan city like London where crime is outwardly accepted, because in the UK at least, there's a sort of inherently taboo and superstitious nature around small idyllic villages being the site of danger and despair. Angel makes this abundantly clear to his constabulary early on. There's always something going on. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it isn't happening. It's just too good to be true that crime doesn't happen when it's universally commonplace in every society, whether you like it or not. He's dismissed as cynical, conspiratorial, and even just straight up fascist, given he's yet to adapt to such a vastly different setting. And while he's not wrong that they should do a better job policing, it is true he overestimates just how much there ultimately is to do. In Shaun and World's End, Peg's characters are portrayed as alienating individuals for their selfish and irresponsible demeanors, but that social alienation is just as apparent with Angel, whose joyless, rule and regulation obsessed attitude makes him a misery to be around. In fact, in contrast to Shaun, the reason Angel gets dumped by his girlfriend is because he's too serious and devoted to his work. It's not that he's unlikable, he's just a committed professional. He doesn't discriminate, he doesn't let feelings or emotions affect his judgment, but where people take issue is that he doesn't know when to switch off and just be a human being, flaws and all. Speaking for myself, I'm thankfully not as bad as I used to be, but I can relate to his inability to switch off. One thing I'm still struggling to change is that uptight perfectionist who doesn't know when to let go, and if I'm not always worrying about work, everything will crumble into failure. There's no in-between with my unreasonable line of thinking. Friends would rightfully say to me there's a time and place for it. Take the job seriously, yes, but leave the baggage at work when it comes time to looking up and embracing the world around you, and vice versa. It doesn't ever address this, but I always interpreted Angel as a character constantly swallowing his flaws and disciplining himself to not unravel, which he does after finally confirming his suspicions about the town. He has a peace lily to contrast his stoic demeanor. Like the Winchester to Shaun, it's a symbol of Angel trying to maintain peace and harmony like his job requires. It allows him to be sensitive and even vulnerable because he doesn't have anywhere else to unload his isolated frustrations until he meets his partner Danny. I always interpreted this from the nerve-damaged hand he sustained after being stabbed by Peter Jackson in a Santa costume. Yeah, that's a line I never thought I'd say. It's a negligible detail, but it clearly triggers him when asked about it, suggesting he has unresolved trauma. Thus, his injury serves as a symbol of his constant bravado drive for perfection after this one imperfect moment in his career. It's a troubling obsession that's further manifested in the village itself, as the Neighborhood Watch Association is established as so hyper-focused on cleaning up the town's imperfections to retain the Village of the Year award that comes at the cost of freedom and true, genuine harmony. When he starts working with Danny, tension persists as Danny doesn't take his responsibilities seriously and continues to downplay any suspicion of danger and criminal activity, a product of policing a village with nothing to police. However, they do begin to find common ground when Danny proves himself to be a much more competent, quicker learner than first appeared, and soon enough, when Angel starts showing respect for Danny, Danny is able to break the ice and teach Angel a thing or two by introducing him to the lighter, looser side of life, where we don't have to constantly keep up our guard and act as hyper-strict adults. They end up being this perfect partnership because while one can teach responsibility and discipline, the other can draw a line of when and where that responsibility and discipline dictate your ability to just be human. At least reasonably speaking, that is. That's not to say you shouldn't lose sight of good behavior. Like Sean, it's not about all change being good, it's how a little change can be enough so we don't fall into the emotional and interpersonal stagnation that can insidiously destroy our relationship with others and ourselves. When the murders commence, they're treated as accidents as Angel starts to suspect there's a connection between the deaths, especially after witnessing the local florist get stabbed with her own shears, thus confirming his suspicions that a killer is on the loose. Going back to what I said about Wright being inspired by Giallo films, the gore and splatter violence is surprisingly gruesome for what the setup entails. It feels natural in Sean, obviously, but what works about it here is that it propels a legitimately savage contrast to the lighthearted atmosphere, whilst maintaining a gallows humor edge to it. While admittedly the CGI hasn't aged well, if you take the church roof collapsing on Adam Buxton, who plays the incompetent local reporter, it's a spectacularly gnarly visual for such a quirky little film, yet it further plays into the de-romanticization I mentioned in Sean. Angel gets increasingly frustrated at Danny's constant talk about gunfights, car chases, and all the other make-believe you see in films, with Angel reminding Danny that real life just isn't as eventful or exciting, and anytime a spectacle like Danny describes does occur, it's a perilous, highly nuanced situation not to be treated lightly, a reality that isn't so much the case when all hell breaks loose in the finale. The gruesome exaggeration helps demystify the watered-down cushion world that Danny and the rest of the town lives in. They act with indifference and nonchalance around mutilated corpses because, as they say, accidents happen every day, so they're desensitized to the normality of its occurrence. However, change the context to murder, suddenly death is taboo. It's now shocking and unspeakable, which is wonderfully foreshadowed in Angel's first introduction to the town, where the constant politeness and all too peaceful atmosphere, mixed with Timothy Dalton's brooding supermarket owner Simon Skinner, give off strong Wicker Man vibes. The town gradually feels less like a close-knit community and more like a cult bound by unspoken rules and totalitarianism. Ironic given Angel is described by his opponents as a fascist, policing over people's supposed freedom, when the revelation is just how surveillance-heavy and frighteningly Gestapo the villains actually are. It's a smokescreen of blissful ignorance and blind obedience that Angel is basically gaslit into when his accusation of Skinner being the killer doesn't add up, despite his blatantly convenient appearances and sinister comments following each death. The motive for the killings is ingenious. They play into both the highly orchestrated crimes and overly elaborate explanations you see in low-key detective shows, and the sort of bleak, meaningless simplicity you see in the likes of gritty film noirs. So naturally at this point, brace yourself. Okay, so let me try to badly explain Angel's deliberately contrived explanation for all the deaths. Angel concludes that Skinner killed a contractor who was buying land with the help of a wealthy solicitor and a council worker who could fast forward the plans to construct a retail park that would heavily compete with Skinner's business, and later killed the reporter for revealing the true land value to a florist who decided to sell her land to developers of a bypass, which following her death would then be inherited by Skinner because they were related. However, regardless of how much of that I got wrong, none of it actually matters. As Skinner later remarks, the truth is far simpler than that. When Angel discovers that there are multiple killers, specifically the entire Neighborhood Watch Alliance. After evading his own murder, Angel confronts the Alliance dressed as cultists at the local cemetery, playing into the cult-like Wicker Man vibes I suspected, where they reveal they murder anyone who simply does not align with their values or misrepresents the quality of the village, all in an effort to maintain their reputation and Covenant Village of the Year award. That's right, the reporter is killed because of his poor grammar, the rich guy because of his poor acting, his girlfriend because she had an annoying laugh, the contractor because they didn't like his house, and the florist because she was leaving town and they didn't want her sharing her talents with the competition. They've maintained their secrecy thanks to the police chief, who became hatefully disillusioned of outsiders after his wife's suicide when she failed to obtain the Village of the Year award in the past, following the arrival of Romani travelers who they blamed for supposedly desecrating the town. It's surprisingly more messed up how the motive isn't that, well, motivated. They claim it's for the greater good, but they're ultimately petty non-issues perpetuated by snooty gossipers and weird xenophobic neighbours, which is fitting to the theme of de-romanticization, as that pettiness is kinda representative of the issues found in many small parochial towns. Growing up in a small village myself, that low-key antagonism feels pretty genuine, and the exaggeration of the conceit even relates to a point made by Edgar Wright when promoting The World's End. Hot Fuzz was shot in Wright's hometown of Somerset, but as he put it, these places are never as idyllic as you remember. There was always something negative to tarnish that perfect peaceful impression of your nostalgia. What Hot Fuzz portrays is a town that's closed off and superficial despite being so aggressively local and operated by the people. Like Sean and the Winchester, it might have some symbolic sentimental connection to its villagers, but it's ultimately nothing special, nothing worth romanticizing, and sure as hell not something worth killing over. When Angel is chased and falls into the catacombs to find the corpses of those he arrested or the town took issue with, it's a frightening scene that, like Sean's final act, brings us crashing back down to reality. Yet, in a wonderful twist to the bleakness of Sean, to bring inevitable change, Angel embraces the spectacle and returns to gloriously shoot up the town after getting the rest of the officers on his side. The whole ironic punchline is essentially a town fighting for peace and harmony, but is de-romanticized into one that's secretly totalitarian and punishes with death. It's a bit of a police state despite all their efforts to delegitimize Angel's efforts to police. He actually would be a perfect ally, but they were never going to convince him, because unlike them, despite similar obsessions with perfection, Angel ultimately has good, honest morals worth fighting for. In the end, Angel saves the town and puts the bad guys behind bars, because brilliantly they never kill anyone, as policing is a bit different in the UK. But going back to a comment made by Wright and Pegg regarding the weird utopia endings of all three films, they suggest Sanford technically loses a bit of its fickle freedom now that the locals can't blissfully ignore petty crimes. In a similar inverse to Sean, with Angel in charge, he might let go of his old ways when off duty, but when the blue lights are flashing and it's time to take things seriously, his old habits continue to flourish. And that is Hot Fuzz. That's 2 down, 1 to go. The final film, The World's End, will consolidate and conclude much of what we talked about up to this point, so I will try to avoid retreading some of that ground, but nonetheless, until next time, stay safe, stay away from deactivated sea mines, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.